Almost 100 days have passed since that morning that divided time in two. For the institutional world, the file is already closed. Official statements have completed their cycle, communiques have stopped being updated, and the administrative machinery has continued to advance, as if silence were a legitimate form of conclusion. However, outside of that framework, far from the limits imposed by geography or censorship, collective memory has refused to accept oblivion. Yu Menglong, the young artist who for years was described as kind, reserved, and almost invisible within a ravenous industry, has not disappeared from public consciousness. On the contrary, as the calendar approaches the symbolic threshold of the 100 days, his name has begun to reappear in unexpected spaces. From discreet ceremonies in Taiwan to vigils in Thailand and prayer gatherings in Malaysia, the displays of remembrance have crossed borders with an intensity that challenges any attempt at definitive closure. In many East Asian traditions, the 100th day is not just any date. It represents the moment when mourning should transform into acceptance, when the living continue their path, and the soul of the deceased completes a crucial stage of its transit. It is, in theory, the endpoint of weeping. But for those who closely followed the life and career of Yu Menglong, that day did not mark a closure, but an opening. A symbolic border that, far from separating the past from the present, ignited new questions. The scenes at the memorials did not speak of scandal or direct accusations. There were flowers, photographs, simple foods he used to enjoy, intimate gestures charged with affection. However, within that respectful silence also floated an unease that was difficult to ignore. Why, if everything was resolved, did so many people feel the need to gather, to pray, to remember together? What is it that has not yet found rest? As the days went by, attention ceased to focus solely on the loss and began to shift toward the details. Small fragments of the past were reviewed with a different gaze. Songs, images, brief daily videos acquired new meanings when observed from the distance left by absence. Not as conclusive proofs, but as indications of a life that was perhaps marked by tensions invisible to the general public. This is not just a story of farewell, nor is it an accusation formulated from certainty. It is, above all, an attempt to understand how the gears work that surround those who shine on stage, but rarely control the frame that defines their movements. Behind the glamour and the measured smiles, there exists a system where silence can be as eloquent as speech. From here on, memory transforms into analysis. Not to dictate sentences, but to observe with attention. Because when a story refuses to disappear, perhaps it is not due to nostalgia, but because there are still questions demanding to be heard. When a person lives under constant surveillance, they cannot always speak clearly. Sometimes, the only way to express oneself is through the margins, in spaces so small that only those who observe with extreme attention can perceive them. In the case of Yu Menglong, many of those margins seemed invisible while he was still present. It was only after his departure that certain details began to be reviewed with another sensibility, as if time had sharpened the collective gaze. One of the elements that aroused the most attention was a musical interpretation that, at the time, went practically unnoticed. It was a version sung with sobriety, without excessive drama, faithful to the reserved style that always characterized Yu Menglong. However, upon listening to it again, some listeners noticed a minimal variation in the pronunciation of a key phrase. It was not an evident change, nor an open alteration of the original lyrics. It was a subtle difference, almost imperceptible, that was only revealed by slowing down the audio and listening to it repeatedly. From a strictly linguistic point of view, the ambiguity was understandable. In singing, certain nasal sounds and soft consonants can be confused with ease. There is no conclusive proof that allows one to affirm a deliberate intention. However, the emotional impact of that difference was profound. The phrase, understood in one way, conveyed resignation before destiny. Interpreted in another, it suggested something different, the impossibility of deciding for oneself. It was not a direct affirmation, but a sensation. And that sensation was enough to unsettle those who began to connect the dots. This type of reading does not seek to establish a definitive truth. Rather, it reveals a collective need to find meaning in that which, in life, seemed normal. When a trajectory is cut short abruptly, the past reorders itself. Daily gestures, words spoken without emphasis, even prolonged silences acquire a new weight. In that process, music became a space of emotional projection, a place where many felt a message might have been hidden that was impossible to say out loud. That perception was reinforced with the circulation of a brief video recorded in an apparently trivial context. Yu Menglong was signing autographs for followers who waited for him with patience. The scene was simple, almost routine, until a hand appeared in the frame and pulled at his arm, interrupting the gesture. There was no struggle or audible words. Only a quick movement, a clear signal that the situation had to end. Yu Menglong's face, captured for a few seconds, reflected a mixture difficult to define: attention, caution, a slight contained tension. Again, there is no explicit accusation in these images. In the entertainment industry, times are strictly controlled, and work teams usually intervene to meet tight schedules. However, the public's reaction did not focus solely on the action, but on what it symbolized. For many, that gesture reinforced the idea of an artist who had to measure every movement, even in an act as basic as thanking those who supported him. From there, a broader question began to take shape. It was not about an isolated episode or a specific coordination error. The unease pointed to something deeper, the possibility that Yu Menglong had lived within a framework of decisions made by others, where his autonomy was limited by invisible structures. These structures do not always manifest in a violent or explicit manner. Often they operate through implicit norms, contractual pressures, and expectations that are not discussed in public. The analysis of these indications does not imply affirming that every gesture was a signal for help. It implies recognizing that, in certain environments, silence can become a survival strategy. When speaking has consequences, people learn to communicate in other ways, or simply to remain silent. In that context, even a slight variation in a song or a contained expression in front of a camera can be interpreted as attempts to preserve a minimal parcel of personal control. The figure of Yu Menglong, seen from this perspective, ceases to be just that of a talented young artist and transforms into that of an individual immersed in a complex system. A system where success does not guarantee freedom and where the public image can hide a much more restricted reality. It is not an exceptional narrative within the world of show business, but it is one that is rarely examined closely while the lights are still on. Having reached this point, attention is not directed toward a definitive conclusion, but toward reflection. How many similar stories remain hidden behind complacent interpretations? How many times does apparent normality cover up dynamics that are only revealed when it is already too late? These questions do not seek immediate culprits, but understanding. The story of Yu Menglong, observed from these early indications, poses a fundamental concern. When words cannot be spoken, when gestures are interrupted and decisions seem foreign, where is the space for individual freedom? It is a question that is not answered with quick certainties, but one that opens the door to examining with greater attention the mechanisms that surround those who live under the constant scrutiny of success. When words cease to be sufficient, images begin to take their place. In the case of Yu Menglong, this transition was almost imperceptible at first, but ended up becoming one of the most controversial cores of the public debate. It was not about statements, interviews, or official documents. It was an image. A single photograph was enough to alter the tone of the conversation and shift it toward much more uncomfortable terrain. The image appeared linked to an artistic space known for its experimental aesthetic and dense atmosphere. It was not an explanatory photograph, nor was it accompanied by a clear context. It showed a dark, oppressive scene where the central figure seemed immobilized in a black chair. The visual composition conveyed restriction, forced silence, and a tension difficult to ignore. There was no official confirmation regarding the origin of the image or the identity of the people appearing in it. Even so, its impact was immediate. From the first moment, the debate divided into two clearly differentiated currents. On one side, those who argued that it was an artistic work, a symbolic representation without a direct connection to the artist's personal life. From this perspective, any attempt to link the image with real experiences was seen as an emotional overinterpretation, a collective projection fueled by grief. On the other side, an increasingly large group emerged that could not ignore the coherence between that image and other previously observed episodes. The strength of the image did not reside in what it proved, but in what it suggested. It did not state facts. It did not explicitly denounce anyone. But it functioned as a mirror where many believed they recognized patterns already present in Yu Menglong's trajectory. The sensation of control, the lack of autonomy, the impossibility of speaking openly. Everything seemed to find a visual representation in that motionless, silent scene with no visible escape. This phenomenon revealed something fundamental about the way the public processes incomplete narratives. When there are no clear answers, people resort to symbols. And in an era dominated by visual communication, an image can condense emotions, suspicions, and questions that language fails to articulate. In this case, the photograph became a point of convergence for all the concerns accumulated over years. From that moment on, the conversation ceased to focus solely on Yu Menglong as an individual and began to expand toward a broader reflection on the functioning of the entertainment industry. Many spectators asked themselves how many times they had consumed cultural products without stopping to think about the human conditions that made them possible. The image acted as an uncomfortable reminder that behind every illuminated stage exists a power structure that is rarely shown. The comparison with other cases did not take long to appear. The name of Chao Renliang began to be mentioned with greater frequency, not as a direct accusation, but as an unsettling echo. In both cases, the public remembered trajectories marked by a mixture of talent, intermittent exposure, and prolonged silences. They also remembered signals that, at the time, seemed irrelevant and that were now reinterpreted under a different light. This association was not based on conclusive evidence, but on a shared perception, the sensation that certain environments can exert a constant and silent pressure on those who depend on them to exist professionally. In this context, the figure of the artist presents itself as vulnerable, trapped between expectations, contracts, and decisions made by others. It is not a new narrative, but it is one that usually remains on the margins of official discourse. Social media played a central role in this phase of the process. Platforms that are normally used for promotion and entertainment transformed into spaces of collective analysis. Users from different countries began to share interpretations, to compare timelines, and to discuss symbols. This exchange did not produce definitive truths, but it did generate a shared consciousness that something did not quite fit in the simplified version of the facts. At the same time, warnings emerged about the risks of these types of dynamics. Some observers pointed out that the desperate search for meaning could lead to hasty conclusions. They recalled the importance of distinguishing between critical analysis and speculation without foundation. These voices were not ignored, but neither did they manage to dispel the general unease. The doubt was already installed, and with it, a deep need for understanding. The most significant aspect of this stage was not the appearance of new evidence, but the change in public perception. Yu Menglong ceased to be seen solely as a tragic figure and began to be considered a symbol. A symbol of the hidden tensions that can exist in a system where image is the priority and the individual voice is easily replaceable. The photograph, regardless of its real origin, fulfilled the function of opening a space for reflection that did not exist before. In that space, the central question was no longer what exactly had happened at a specific moment, but how it is possible for certain conditions to become normalized to the point of going unnoticed. The entertainment industry, with its accelerated pace and rigid hierarchy, can turn pressure into routine and silence into a norm. When this happens, signs of distress become diluted in everyday life. Thus, the image became a turning point. It did not solve the mystery, but it deepened it. It did not offer answers, but it forced the formulation of new questions. And above all, it shifted attention toward a structural level, where the focus was no longer just on one person, but on the system that surrounded them. Upon closing this stage of the analysis, it remains clear that the controversy is not fed solely by material evidence. It is nourished by the persistent sensation that there are incomplete stories, fragmented truths that do not find an official channel to express themselves. In that void, images speak. And when they do, they rarely leave the observer indifferent. As public attention shifted from personal indications toward a broader understanding of the context, a structural question inevitably arose. Even if Yu Menglong had wanted to change his professional destiny, would he really have had the possibility to do so? This question led many observers to examine more closely the corporate web that accompanied his career from the early years. Yu Menglong's professional journey seemed, on the surface, to follow a common trajectory within the entertainment industry. After gaining visibility on a talent show, he signed a long-term contract with a management company. These types of agreements, common for young artists, are usually presented as a guarantee of stability and long-term development. However, they also imply a significant cession of control, especially in the initial stages of the career, when the margin for negotiation is limited. With the passage of time, signs of friction began to appear. Attempts to redefine his path, discrete movements that suggested a desire for greater autonomy, and finally, a prolonged period of scarce media exposure. For the general public, this absence was interpreted as a natural pause or a personal choice. Nevertheless, within the logic of the sector, such a prolonged disappearance rarely occurs without structural causes. The concept of professional freezing is well known in the artistic sphere. It does not always manifest explicitly. It does not necessarily imply a formal prohibition to work, but a progressive withdrawal of resources, opportunities, and visibility. The artist continues to exist contractually, but remains outside the strategic decisions that determine who appears, when, and under what conditions. In that intermediate state, the career neither advances nor dissolves completely. It simply stagnates. When a change of management company was finally announced, many interpreted the news as a liberation. However, subsequent analysis of the corporate structures revealed a more complex reality. The companies, although different in name and appearance, shared shareholding links and relationships of influence that situated them within the same ecosystem of power. From this perspective, the change did not represent a total break, but a relocation within the same framework. This type of web is not exclusive to a single case or a single region. In highly concentrated industries, large conglomerates often control multiple entities that operate apparently independently. For artists, this can translate into a sensation of movement without real displacement. The door opens, but the corridor leads to the same place. Some voices coming from the sector itself began to provide indirect testimonies. Producers and directors pointed out that, for years, Yu Menglong's name barely came up in planning conversations. Not for a lack of talent or prior recognition, but due to a deliberate absence of institutional push. In a market where visibility is the main capital, not being promoted is equivalent, in practice, to not existing. This point marked one of the most revealing moments of the analysis. The question was no longer whether Yu Menglong had been harmed by individual decisions, but how the dynamics of a system could limit a person's options without the need to resort to extreme measures. The pressure was not exerted through direct confrontation, but through omission. The career became fragile not due to visible attacks, but due to the lack of structural support. Facing such a scenario, the capacity for individual resistance is considerably reduced. Breaking a contract, Abandoning a network of contacts or facing a conglomerate implies risks that few can assume, especially when professional identity depends almost entirely on that same system. The narrative of the artist who simply chooses to leave ignores the complexity of the economic, legal, and symbolic dependencies that surround them. The comparison with other cases, like that of Qiao Renliang, began to acquire a different nuance in this context. It was not about establishing direct parallels, nor suggesting identical causes, but about observing patterns. Interrupted trajectories, prolonged silences, a shared sense of isolation within structures supposedly designed to protect and promote. These elements, considered together, reinforce the perception of a broader systemic problem. At this point in the story, the figure of Yu Menglong emerges not only as an individual, but as a representation of a fundamental tension between the human being and the machinery that surrounds them. A machinery that is efficient, powerful, and in many cases indifferent to the emotional consequences of its decisions. Success, in this framework, does not guarantee well-being. Contractual stability does not ensure dignity, and past visibility does not protect against future silence. The analysis of this network of relationships does not lead to a closed conclusion. It does not identify culprits with specific names, nor does it offer a definitive resolution. What it does do is expose a logic of operation that is rarely discussed openly. A logic where mobility is limited, where exits are narrow, and where the cost of challenging the established order can be high. At the end of this journey, the story of Yu Menglong is situated at a turning point. Not as an isolated case, but as a warning sign. An invitation to observe with greater attention how power is distributed in the entertainment industry and what real margin those who depend on it to exist professionally actually have. The question that remains suspended is not whether the system failed in a concrete case, but how many times it operates in the same way without being questioned. And in that silence, once again, collective memory finds its reason not to close the chapter. As the end of this journey approaches, the story returns to the point where it began: memory. The 100-day ceremonies, held in different countries, were not simple symbolic acts. They represented a collective gesture of resistance against oblivion. In every candle lit, in every prayer spoken, the same idea was manifested. The life of Yu Menglong cannot be reduced to a footnote or an archived file. With the passage of time, grief has been transforming. What started as sadness turned into unease, and unease gave way to deeper reflection. It is no longer solely about understanding what happened in the last moments of his life, but about questioning the environment that surrounded him for years. An environment where apparent success coexisted with prolonged silences and where professional stability did not always guarantee personal well-being. The figure of Yu Menglong thus emerges as something more than that of a young artist whose career was cut short. He becomes a mirror reflecting the tensions inherent in the contemporary entertainment industry. An industry capable of creating idols, but also of isolating them. Capable of offering visibility, but equally of withdrawing it without public explanations. In that fragile balance, the person runs the risk of being diluted behind the persona. The lesson this story leaves is neither simple nor comfortable. It reminds us that fame does not protect against human vulnerability. That behind every carefully constructed image exists an individual with real emotional limits. It also poses a broader question, one that transcends a single case. To what extent do we accept as normal dynamics that, observed closely, prove deeply dehumanizing? Collective memory has proven to be a space where these questions can be kept alive. Although it does not always have the power to offer immediate justice, it does fulfill an essential function, preventing silence from imposing itself completely. In a world where attention shifts rapidly, remembering becomes a conscious, almost political act. To remember is to refuse to close one's eyes to the uncomfortable. Looking toward the future, it is possible that many of the unknowns surrounding Yu Menglong may never find a definitive answer. However, his story has already generated a tangible effect. It has opened conversations that previously remained relegated to the margins. It has prompted others to share similar experiences and has invited the public to observe with greater sensitivity that which they consume as entertainment. The true legacy of this account may not lie in discovering an absolute truth, but in the capacity to learn from uncertainty. In recognizing that the system that produces stars must also be examined with the same rigor with which its brilliance is admired. Because only then is it possible to imagine an environment where talent does not have to pay an invisible price. In the end, Yu Menglong is remembered not only for his work, but for what his absence has revealed. His name remains as a silent reminder that every human story deserves to be listened to with attention. And as long as there is someone willing to ask, to reflect, and not to forget, this chapter will remain open, not as an accusation, but as a permanent invitation to look beyond the surface.